Thank you, Bruce, for your call to action around the impact our food system has on climate change. We're shaking things up today and having a conversation in the middle of worship. Our purpose is to reflect on what you've shared with us and how we can take it to heart here in BC. And I'd like to introduce the people joining us now. We have Noella Prescod, who was on the planning team for this year's spring seminar as the youth co-dean. Noella, can you tell us just a brief little bit about what that experience was like for you?
Hello, I'm Noella. I use she, her pronouns. So yeah, as Kiersten said, I was one of the youth deans for the intergenerational spring seminar at the UN office. And for me, it was actually a really amazing experience, not only to be able to plan the seminar, but also to be able to host some of the activities and meet a lot of new people. Personally, my favorite thing is probably the planning experience and getting to meet so many people with different backgrounds and different point of views on the current crisis of climate change and food inequities. So yeah, it was actually a really cool experience and a bit out of my comfort zone, but yeah, I had a really fun time.
Thank you. And we also have Olivia Hall, is our youth program coordinator here at UCV. Olivia.
Hi, you all know me if you're at UCV. I coordinate the youth group, and I was lucky enough to attend the seminar that Noella and Bruce organized, and that's the extent of my expertise. So today I am asking questions.
Thank you, Olivia. We also have Dr. Michael Bomford, who is one of our members. He teaches sustainable agriculture at Kwantlen University, and his research has looked at agricultural impact on carbon emissions.
Hello, everybody. I'll leave that introduction at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I have one question to start us off. Bruce, can you tell us why UUs are at the United Nations, and do other religions also have offices there?
Absolutely. Thank you for your question, and it's great to be speaking with you. A couple of names I'll just throw out at you. First of all is John Peters Humphrey. He won the Order of Canada. He was a diplomat at the United Nations, and he actually drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you read it, and it talks about the inherent worth and dignity of every person, it starts to sound like our own 7 principles, because it was. So that's a great Canadian who started the UN, was one of the founders of the organization. Later, Adlai Stevenson, who had been a governor of Illinois and ran for president on the Democratic ticket twice and lost to President Eisenhower, was appointed by Eisenhower's successor, John F. Kennedy, to be the US ambassador to the UN, and he was a Unitarian. And he told Dana Greeley, who was the president of the first of the UUA when the 2 denominations joined in 1961, that we should have a connection with the UN. And so we started in 1962, a year later, on that recommendation. The Presbyterians are at the UN, the Lutherans, the Methodists, the Quakers, the Mennonites, lots and lots of Catholics, different orders of Catholic. There are also the World Council of Churches is at the United Nations, Religions for Peace, which is an organization founded by Unitarian Universalists and other organizations, other faith traditions. The Parliament of the World's Religions. We've got a lot of religious people at the UN of all sorts, and I love the interfaith work that we do together. We are a small denomination, and if we were to go to the UN and said you should do something about climate change, they would be justified in not listening to us. But when we band together with Catholics and Jews and Muslims and all sorts of Protestants and the World Council of Churches and the Parliament of the World's Religions and said you need to do something about climate change, they have to listen.
Thank you. I learned some things that I had not known before. So Olivia and Noella have some questions that our youth group generated after reading your talk, so I'll turn this over to them.
Okay, the first question is, why do places like India feel targeted, and how can other countries change that?
Well, certainly at the Paris Climate Accords, India made a big stand, basically saying that the developed countries of the world, like Canada and the United States, have for centuries used fossil fuels to develop their countries and build their infrastructure and become wealthy, prosperous countries. And India is a developing country, and it says, well, why are you going to penalize us and tell us we can't use fossil fuels when we're just trying to get our country up and going? And they're right, and it's not fair. And what the Paris Climate Accords called for was a global climate fund that would help developing countries catch up and take the steps necessary to adapt and mitigate to climate change. And the United States has not given its fair share to the Global Climate Fund, and neither have other nations. So it's on us to really make up the difference between the wealth that we have and help the developing countries really deal with the prospects of climate change, including India.
Thank you. Our next question is about how you compare, in your talk, you compare our struggle against climate change to a war. And we're very familiar with hearing that kind of language. In the war comparison, in that metaphor, there's a clear enemy. And with climate change, if there is an enemy, it's us, it's human actions and humans as a global force. How do you deal with that and with the pessimism that can come from that?
Thank you for the question, and maybe that's an unfortunate metaphor on my part. But what I think about a war, and thinking of the Second World War, the United States, Britain, Canada, all the nations involved in the Second World War had to mobilize everything to fight the war. Governments had to basically tell car manufacturers, you can't manufacture cars anymore, you need to manufacture tanks and airplanes. And the whole economy of the country and the commercial and everything, the whole, the commercial and economic life of the country had to be devoted to the objective of winning the war. And what I'm saying is, in order to deal with climate change, we need the same kind of determination, and we need to readjust our economies, our commerce, our ways of doing things as if we were going to war, and take all of our resources and put everything in the service of adapting and mitigating climate change. So there's no real enemy. It's just we need to marshal all of our resources and do it working together to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
I'll just jump in and say I really appreciate that that question, Olivia. It seems that absolutely we need wholesale societal-wide change in order to deal with the changing climate to address this crisis. And yet your question also, raises that I think this metaphor of war has often been used to try to spur societal change, and often people haven't responded in really good ways to the use of that metaphor. And I think of things like the war on drugs and the war on poverty and the war on terror. We have a lot of we often use this language of war when we're calling for wholesale change, and it hasn't always worked out all that well. So maybe we need to look for other metaphors. Maybe it's the Green New Deal, or maybe one way or another we have to think of ways that we change everything for the climate.
Thank you. Those are both good points. The next question is, why are people eating more meat, and what is spurring it on?
I think it has something to do maybe with supply and demand. And if you go back to our grandparents, great-grandparents, meat was a special thing. You had Thanksgiving turkey, and you would have meat on at a wedding or something like that. But people didn't eat lots of meat 3 times a day, every day of the year. People couldn't afford it. It wasn't available. And it was considered a luxury and something special. And we are now eating tons of meat 3 times a day, every day, sometimes more than 3 times a day. And it has gotten to the point where it's harming the planet. Um, and again, I think, producers of cattle, particularly beef being the biggest problem for the environment, are meeting the demand. So as we demand more and more beef to eat, they are clearing more forest lands for cattle raising so that they can meet the demand. And so they're meeting our demands for more and more meat, and they're cutting down forests, and they're providing more land for cattle raising. And that's having a devastating effect on the planet. And so what the United Nations has said very clearly is that more land needs to be devoted to forests and less land to cattle raising and to animal agriculture generally. And that means we need a more plant-based diet.
And I'll jump in and say this is in some ways related to your question about why India feels unfairly targeted, in that if we look at who's eating meat, where meat is being consumed, there are huge discrepancies, huge inequalities, I suppose. There are countries where people eat meat all the time and there's a lot of meat consumption per person, and countries where meat consumption is quite low per person. And it has tended to be the wealthier countries that are eating more meat and the poorer countries that are eating less meat. Now, when you ask about why meat consumption is increasing, most of the increase is happening in the countries that have been poorer for a long time, the people who have not been eating much meat, that there's an increase in consumption. And it's still, if you look at the amount consumed per person, it's much less than in wealthy countries like Canada. Canada's meat consumption, particularly if we look at beef consumption, has not been increasing. Our per capita consumption has been declining, and yet even with those declines, we still eat far more per person than in many other parts of the world. So I think it's important for the countries where people are eating a lot of meat to reduce consumption, because we have no leg to stand on. We can't tell anybody stop eating more meat when we're still eating more than they are, right? And so we need to think kind of about what's fair, and this trend of decreased consumption of meat it needs to continue. But it's important, that we recognize that here in Canada, our meat consumption is actually declining, and particularly, it's really important that we're also aware of the types of meat, and so Bruce brought up cattle production, which is particularly problematic, both because the cattle need either a lot of space or a lot of food that has to be grown in on a lot of land, and so people are taking down forests to grow soybeans or corn to feed cattle. But also because cattle, their digestive system releases methane, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and so cattle tends to be different from animals with other digestive systems like poultry or pigs. And what you have seen in Canada in the last decades is a decrease in per capita beef consumption, but an increase in chicken and pork production. And honestly, from a greenhouse gas perspective, that's probably a helpful change. So even if people aren't able to go entirely vegetarian, if they can switch the types of meat that they're consuming, that's a step in the right direction.
Thank you for bringing that up. And we already kind of touched on this, but how can we reverse the meat trends and continue decreasing the amount of meat we're eating?
Well, I think as Mike has brought up already, I think it's already changing, and I think people are beginning to change their habits, both in Canada and the United States and in the Western world generally. There is some awareness that particularly eating beef is a problem. I was at the climate conference in Katowice, and it really bothered me that there I was in Poland, and I saw McDonald's hamburgers everywhere. And I actually talked to the Minister of Health of Poland, and I said, you know, if you're gonna eat meat, eat pork. That's what the Polish people eat. And now you're going from pork to beef, and that's going from bad to worse. So, you know, if you gotta eat meat, eat pork, and but not so much. But and he didn't listen to me. But I think, you know, there are meat substitutes, vegetarian food. I think as people get more adept at cooking and making good vegetarian dishes, it's very tasty, and the desire for meat is less. There is also kind of a status to eating meat too, and it's getting people not to think that eating, you know, a big steak makes you a rich or important or prestigious person. And I think hopefully as society is moving forward, eating a big steak might be looked as a bad social thing to do. People are beginning to say, "Oh, why would you do that?" You know. So I think the more society can change, and seeing, you know, eating more vegetarian, more plant-based diet is actually a cool thing to do, and eating a big thick steak is an uncool thing to do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Bruce. And I think that just as we need to be aware of the inherent inequalities in the world and the fact that per capita consumption in very wealthy countries, per capita consumption of meat tends to be much higher than in poorer countries, we also have this tremendous opportunity to learn from societies where meat hasn't been a big part of the diet, because there have been like there's amazing recipes, amazing food that people have developed over the years, and we can tap into that. You know, we can have a lot to learn.
Thank you.
Our next question is about the phrase that Bruce, you used in your talk, all modern societies are unsustainable. And if we accept that to be true, then where do we look for help, for inspiration, for guidance? Mike just touched on countries and cultures that historically don't eat a lot of meat. Where else do we look for inspiration if everywhere you look in the modern world is in some way damaging to the environment?
Yeah, I've gotten in trouble for this, but anyway, here we go. I hold up indigenous peoples as an example because I think they live very sustainably on the planet. And actually, at a worship service that I spoke at last week, somebody brought up Easter Island, where the indigenous people of Easter Island cut down all the trees and pretty much destroyed their culture. So I don't want to hold up indigenous people as absolute gods or perfect or anything like that. But in my observation, indigenous peoples around the world have lived more sustainably on the earth, have been more gentle with the environment, have used resources more sustainably. I have a very good friend who runs an indigenous organization in Seattle, so not far from you there in Vancouver, and it's called the Seventh Generation Fund. And they are thinking 7 generations out. And I wish all of us would do that and not just think of ourselves or our children or our grandchildren, but think 7 generations ahead. What we do now and how that's going to affect people 7 generations from now. And I think a lot of indigenous people, I won't say all, I don't want to make them too perfect, but I think a lot of indigenous people have found very good ways to live sustainably, and I think we can learn from them and be inspired by them.
And I agree, Bruce, that there are lots of examples of indigenous societies that have lived sustainably, and I think that that examples of sustainable societies probably aren't that rare. We can draw inspiration from many places, but almost I think that if you were to try to mimic really any society's sustainable pattern with a population of 8 billion on a planet with the resources we have, it wouldn't be sustainable any longer. And so I think that we need to we need to recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every individual, but also combat the growth mentality. We need to see value in, I suppose, intelligent decline or in degrowth or something like that, right? And recognize that a part of sustainability long term probably means having fewer people, and that will help us require fewer resources. Because I don't know, I think that it's not just that our current society is kind of worse per person from a sustainability perspective. It's also that we have a lot of people to look after right now.
Thank you. And our last question, so obviously it's really good to try and have to consume less meat or have a plant-based diet, but obviously that is not accessible to everyone, or maybe it's not the best option for some people currently. So what are other personal actions we can take, and what can wealthy countries like Canada do to help the crisis?
I think there's a lot of personal actions we can take, and using less power, getting an electric car instead of using a gasoline fueled car, using more sustainable forms of energy, solar panels and wind power and all of that. These are personal ways that we can lower our personal carbon footprint. But I want to emphasize, we're not going to beat this by ourselves. We need government policies and global policies, international policies, to really, clamp down on the use of fossil fuels and on other ways that we are destroying our environment. So yes, we should all take personal action, but we also need to be personally responsible for making sure our governments take the action that are necessary. And I mentioned in my talk that Canada and the United States and a lot of other countries, but Canada and the United States, I think, are particularly egregious in this area. We are addicted to taking stuff out of the ground, mining and oil and coal and other minerals, digging stuff up and causing environmental problems in the process. And we do it for energy, and we also do it for money to fund the national budget, for one thing. And we need to tell our government to stop it. There are other ways of making money, and there are other ways of making power, and we've got to stop digging stuff out of the ground and leave. We need to leave things in the ground, particularly oil and coal and other fossil fuels, but other minerals as well. Because the mining itself, we wind up polluting water sources, and it's bad. And I would like to see us all get our governments to be more responsible in this regard.
And I certainly agree with you, Bruce. I think we need to change the way our society is structured, and that's much bigger than any individual action. I think from an individual perspective, you're absolutely right about a big part of the problem is the fact that we're burning fossil fuels, that this carbon that was stored underground millions of years ago is now being released very quickly up into the atmosphere as we burn those fossil fuels. And probably from an individual perspective, that's the best thing we can do, is reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. But here we are talking about food systems. And what's really interesting about food systems is that they're different from the rest of the economy. For most of the economy, it's a story about carbon that's released from burning fossil fuels. When we start to deal with agriculture, we are dealing with mostly carbon that comes from soil or carbon that's been stored in forests. So if we destroy forests or destroy peatlands, that releases a tremendous amount of carbon into the atmosphere, just as if we had burnt a fossil fuel. And then we can do that without ever burning a fossil fuel, you know? And so that's maybe a little bit different. And then there are other greenhouse gases that are particularly important in agriculture. And I've already mentioned methane, which comes from really any time that you have anaerobic conditions, so conditions without oxygen. That's what you find in the stomachs of a cow. It's also what you find in flooded agricultural soils. So rice paddies, for example, release methane, and without burning any fossil fuel, you can release a lot of greenhouse gas from those soils. And another really potent greenhouse gas is nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide is found wherever you have excess nitrogen in the system. And you know, with the federal budget that just came out like a week ago, there was money available for farmers to reduce their nitrogen fertilizer use and to find ways to use nitrogen more intelligently. Now, this is not something that any of us might think about when we're going to the grocery store and making food purchases. This is not something that we can change individually, but it's a really important thing. I was really pleased to see the government focusing on the importance of nitrogen fertilizer and on reducing those nitrous oxide emissions. Because really, when we start to look at the food system as a whole, that combined warming potential that comes from carbon release from soils, methane from soils, nitrous oxides from soils, and also then from animals and manures and things like that, those are actually far more important than the carbon that's coming from the fossil fuels in our food system.
Wow, you've given us a lot to think about today. Thank you so much for being here with us. Are there any final words that you'd like to leave us with this morning?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad there's a scientist as part of this panel, so he can take my sort of unscientific remarks and bring science to bear. So I really appreciate Mike being here. And I really admire the commitment of this congregation in dealing with this subject and doing something about it. We all need to work harder, and we need to work individually, but we also need to work with our governments and with the United Nations, with the global structure to save our planet.
And you know, I appreciate you being here too, Bruce, and particularly appreciate you bringing up right at the beginning the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and their connection to the 7 principles. And I want to maybe not be the scientist for the minute and say it's really important as we start to consider food system issues that we recognize the importance of the people all through that system and recognize that there are, well, plenty of examples of injustices in the food system, people who are not being treated fairly or not being treated well, not just when we look at the inequality between nations, but when we look at the people who we hire to harvest our food and the conditions that people work in. And I really hope that as we have these conversations about the greenhouse gas implications of our food systems, we also remember and continue to work on the whole justice within the food system, the treatment of people throughout that system.
Thank you both. And there will be a link below that you will see to lead you to some of those organizations that are speaking to just exactly that issue that Mike brought up about the justice and equity in our farm workers and the people who bring us the food that we need to survive. So thank you both again, and thank you all for joining us this morning. And I believe we will now have a hymn.